Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, DEI in Higher Education, 5 Truths and 5 Myths. My name is Denise Marie Ordway, and I'm the managing editor of the Journalist Resource. I'm also a longtime education reporter, and I'll be moderating today's conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion at U.S. colleges and universities. This is a conversation that comes at an important time. As many of you probably know, legislators across the country have introduced a bunch of bills. They're either considering them or they have passed legislation aimed at restricting or prohibiting or defunding DEI initiatives at public colleges and universities. Just days ago, the governor of the state of Alabama signed into law a bill that prohibits DEI programs, prohibits DEI offices, puts new restrictions on diversity training and diversity statements. If we look at the Chronicle of Higher Education's DEI tracker, we'll see that a total of 81 bills have been introduced across 28 states. Today, you're going to hear from 3 researchers who want to help journalists better understand DEI programs, what DEI is and is not, and help them strengthen their coverage of this topic. You'll hear from Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who is the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. He also directs the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project, often referred to as IRA. IRA is one of the co-hosts of this event with the Journalist Resource. IRA is located at the Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. We'll also be hearing from Erica Jacqueline Licht, who is Research Projects Director of the IRA project. She's a former assistant director at the Center on Culture, Race, and Equity at Bank Street College in New York. And she currently co-hosts a podcast called Untying Knots. We're also going to hear from Chris Wren, the Mildred B. Erickson Distinguished Chair and Professor of Higher, Adult, and Lifelong Education at Michigan State University. Previously, she was an Associate Dean of Student Life at Brown University and a policy analyst for the Massachusetts Board of Higher Education. I am definitely looking forward to this discussion. Before I turn to the presentation, I'd like to get through a few housekeeping items. First, everyone should know that this webinar is being recorded, and everything that you see and hear is on the record, meaning that it can be used for news reporting purposes. The 3 speakers are going to present for a total of 15 to 20 minutes. I'll start off after their presentation by asking a question, maybe 2, depending on our time, depending on the questions we get. And then I want to get right to the audience and let all of you ask questions, because I'm sure you'll have many. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, not the chat box. We welcome you to use the chat box to have conversations, to talk amongst yourselves. Please be aware that the presenters are not monitoring the chat box, so they're not going to be looking if you ask a question or make a comment for one of them. They won't be looking at that. I will be watching the Q&A box for questions to ask presenters. Let's see. Wanted to remind you also that if you put your question in the chat box, there's a good chance we will miss it because the chat box tends to be very busy during our webinars. And lastly, when you do put your question in the Q&A box, will you please also add your name and news organization or other organization? I really like to know who we're engaging with during these conversations, but knowing who is asking questions helps the journalist resource in terms of getting a better sense of of needs and materials we could create to help the journalism community. So thank you. I'm going to hand over the presentation to, I think, Erica. Will you be starting?
I'm going to get started. Thank you so
Oh, sure.
much.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you.
So welcome everyone, and I'm just going to share with you a quick outline of today's presentation, just so you have a sense of where we're going. My colleague Erica will join in just a moment, tell you a little bit more about IRA, and then I'll come back and we'll get started with a brief timeline of how diversity evolved out of the civil rights era. From there, we'll talk about 5 truths and then 5 myths, and we'll open it up for Q&A. Denise will get us started, but we hope that all of you will have questions and an opportunity for engaging with us. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Erica to tell you a little bit about the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. And I just want to say formally, I want to thank Dr. Wren from Michigan State for bringing her expertise to this conversation.
Thanks so much, Khalil. And yes, Dr. Wren, we're so pleased that you could join us as well. So who is IRA? We at heart are a research institute, and we seek to understand what works and what doesn't work when we're looking at anti-racist change. The field of anti-racism, racial justice, racial equity, DEI is expanded and ballooned rapidly, and we'll talk about that history as Khalil mentioned. And so we seek to understand what is the efficacy of these initiatives, how do their outcomes compare to their intended goals and statements and commitments, and what is offered by pairing that research with a look at policy and practice in the field.
Thank you, Erica. And so let me just offer what is inevitably a very truncated summary of some of the legislation that has supported the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, although these two things are not one and the same. And so just to begin, anti-discrimination legislation begins with a Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board, which essentially operationalizes desegregation in the country. Does not quite get us to anti-discrimination law that comes with the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which also includes Title VI, which protects against discrimination. That's an important point because Title VI allows for regulation of higher education vis-a-vis the federal government's budgetary power and its ability to withhold monies from universities that have been found in violation of Title VI. The same is true for Title IX, which, as many of you recognize, is the basis for a much more evolved infrastructure focusing on issues of sexual harassment and, to some degree, gender equity and discrimination in higher education. That is what has brought us the explosion of funding and support for women's collegiate sports. The period following the establishment of anti-discrimination law, we call a period of compliance. And this is a period where the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission essentially becomes the primary federal instrument for reporting on forms of discrimination that exist mostly in the workplace, and the extent to which companies had to build in compliance to make sure that their hiring practices would not lead to complaints and or whistleblower concerns that would essentially put them in jeopardy. And so to some degree, the EEOC extended from the private workplace into higher education. Now, the 1960s also brought with it a carryover essentially from the Kennedy administration's earliest efforts at operationalizing affirmative action in public contracting. And I know we're not talking about workforce development so much as higher education, but I do think it's an important backstory. And it's important because in the attempt to solve for historical injustice, the remedy was to provide some affirmative effort to ensure that in public contracting, particularly at the federal level, that non-white workers and non-white businesses would have an opportunity to gain jobs and contracts. The Nixon administration advances this work in something called the Philadelphia Plan in the 1970s, which essentially was using a Philadelphia case to further the goals of ensuring that workforce development and contracting would ensure greater participation of historically marginalized populations. This is an era that brings with us the Small Business Administration and the Office of Minority Business Enterprise. So that's the infrastructure that begins. And unfortunately, I'm not neutral in this, in the sense that this is a turn away from these commitments. And that is that in the 1970s, we began to see backlash, litigation and legislation ultimately. The litigation, ultimately, the famous Bakke case, which challenged a set of 16 seats that were set aside for a group of people historically unrepresented in higher education in a medical school, particularly and University of California system. The case ultimately is decided by the Supreme Court in the 1978 case, which does two things. One, it abolishes quotas, which essentially ended the era of contracting and employment set-asides that I briefly described. But it creates a diversity rationale in Justice Powell's argument that diversity in and of itself is a benefit and good that ought to be furthered and embraced in higher education, in part to solve for the fact that there was so little diversity, so few people other than white people, more particularly white men, in higher education at the time. And so the Powell shift to diversity is, in the end, how we got the language of diversity. I'm going to move a lot faster here to get to some of the heart of this presentation, but we've lived with the diversity rationale essentially since the 1980s. Under Ronald Reagan, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, faced internal backlash by the Reagan administration through various deregulation policies, but also to weaken the department's capacity to investigate anti-discrimination complaints. That was a funding issue. That was a kind of unwillingness to use the robustness of the department's legislative mandate. And finally, the appointment of Clarence Thomas as head of EEOC, who at the time was a budding, prominent Black conservative who was opposed to affirmative action. And then to finally get us to workforce diversity, the era of assimilation, which was part of the logic and language of colorblindness that Reagan institutionalized and was evidenced in his policy responses, gave us the current paradigm that most people have operated under, which is to say that the world is changing and we need to ensure that greater numbers of people of color will be represented in the workplace and will have an opportunity to help businesses thrive. And that same argument was made in higher education, that greater diversity in higher education benefits everyone. And that's kind of been where we have been between the 1990s and 2010s. And I just want to emphasize here, right up until the Me Too movement, and including concern about sustainability goals or environmental social governance goals, those two pressure points began to put more pressure on accountability and to some degree equity, particularly in the sex and gender realm of both higher education and the private workplace. And then finally, the Equity Center, the E, was institutionalized in a lot of context, particularly in the wake of George Floyd, whereas many places had diversity and inclusion programs, adopted the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was a way of trying to make sense of the failure of diversity to solve for a number of ways in which representation stagnated or reversed, that companies remained, and higher education remained very white at the top, and women remained underrepresented in so many places. And the fact that concerns about disability and LGBTQ rights in some ways remained back burner issues and required much more institutional change in order to accommodate those populations that had largely been invisible. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Wren.
Well, just before we get into Dr. Wren, I'll just add a little bit of more by way of an introduction to our focus today on DEI, specifically in universities and colleges. So as I mentioned earlier, IRA looks at the breadth of these efforts as they pertain to education, but also healthcare, philanthropy, global institutions, and even how countries themselves have reckoned with their histories of harm and systemic violence. We're going to dig in today specifically to this history that Khalil's outlined related to DEI and as it relates to universities and colleges. So what is DEI today? We got to the end of the timeline into the 2000s and 2020s forward. We're talking about university policies, university practices, how the institutions run themselves, including their leadership, and also what it looks like on the ground in terms of the day-to-day and yearly operations of these institutions. These are campus initiatives and offices and training. They're trying to correct for inequities, a long history of exclusion of students, particularly Black, Indigenous, and students of color, as well as other marginalized students that we'll hear in more detail from Dr. Wren in a moment. And they're seeking to create better institutional outcomes. And we'll emphasize here that serve everyone on campus. So this is about educational access as well as attainment and performance. And we'll also highlight this is about students, but also the people who come to work every day on these campuses. So the staff, faculty, senior leadership, and other key stakeholders. So with that, over to you, Dr. Wren. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So first, thanks for having me. I want to thank Ira and the Journalist Resources for bringing me in. I just want to start really quickly with the idea that the purposes of higher education are highly contested. So when reporting on what is higher ed and what is DEI in higher ed, sort of understanding that these contested purposes, people say higher education, post-secondary ed, 2-year, 4-year, private, public, for-profit. It's about workforce development and preparation. They are also about local economic stimulus. We want a college in our town. They are about discovery and invention. They are about particularly STEM research and development. That's been a very important investment on the part of the federal government through higher education. They are about social mobility, but they are also about social reproduction. So there's a lot of talk about how institutions promote social mobility for first generation low-income students, but a lot of the pushback comes around social reproduction, elite admissions, capping the number of people who have access to certain kinds of things. So higher ed is equally about social mobility and social reproduction. And there's a real rub and a real tension there we'll talk about. They're about promoting democracy and civic participation. They're about getting an informed citizenry. They're also very much about personal intellectual growth. This is the place one comes in the olden days to discover oneself, for example. But certainly a lot of the things that happen in post-secondary ed are about your academic major, but also the other things you're doing. The idea that these contested purposes continue to circulate in the public imagination, in policy spaces, in the lives of human beings, because they are contested, when you add, I couldn't figure out, was it add or multiply by DEI? You can choose there. But when you put DEI into the mix with these contested purposes, we end up in a context of rhetorical and symbolical devices that get used for proponents of post-secondary ed, opponents of post-secondary ed. We are in a moment right now where clearly the takedown of post-secondary ed is some people's agenda. I would argue that is part of attacking the, well, it's just right straight out of the totalitarian playbook, right? Attack the civic institutions, including higher education. So just as journalists understand that, like, whenever we're talking to people at institutions in the public sphere, politicians, policymakers, they may be working their own personal different definitions, but they may also be, for rhetorical purposes, engaging different definitions. Next slide, please. So that's sort of that. So who benefits from the DEI efforts that are happening on campuses? To a large extent, these conversations are framed about student access, but they're also about student climate. And clearly, we would say that students from minoritized identity groups, race, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, disability, minoritized identity groups, but also groups or experiences that are underrepresented on campus. So people who benefit from DEI evidence may be first-gen students, those who don't have family members who've attended or graduated from college. Low-income students, student veterans benefit. They are often a minoritized group on campus, depending on the campus. Students who are neurodiverse, students who are caregivers of children or older people. These are both kind of, there's DEI efforts related to inclusion for these populations right now, international students, returning adult students. So DEI efforts often get, particularly in some parts of the country, framed simply around race, sometimes around gender or sex, but thinking about the wider range of what's actually happening on campuses for DEI and the way we talk about DEI on campus includes a number of other buckets, for sure. Back one, please. Yep. Importantly, this is my, if the New York Times writes one more story about the 5 kids who owe $400,000 for getting their degrees from Yale, I'll just die, right? Like, please stop that. The vast majority of post-secondary students in the United States, the vast majority by millions, do not attend institutions with selective admissions. My own institution, a fine Big Ten university with 50,000 students, admits 87% of the students who apply. So even at a, you know, a sort of namey brandish kind of institution, you know, a lot of it, affirmative action doesn't really matter in our admissions. It didn't before the Supreme Court anyway. So what happens at institutions is going to have a much greater impact on higher education than who gets to attend selective institutions. So it's very important when we talk about DEI, it's what's happening on campuses. And therefore, when politicians or legislators restrict curriculum and campus climate efforts, that actually has a much greater harm than curtailing affirmative action in admissions. Next slide, please. Other people who benefit on campus, and Erica mentions, employees, how we create a climate, how people are hired, trained, their ways of advancing through post-secondary education as employees at every job category, from our staff who keep the place running to our presidents and executive leaders. All employees benefit from DEI efforts across the board. An equitable climate promotes achievement by all, regardless of identity experiences. The rising tide does lift all boats. When we do DEI efforts for particular groups of students or particular groups of employees, it can improve the climate for all, that's for sure. We'll talk later about some research that supports that. And then an inclusive mindset on campus begins to create a space where we can see the populations we're not quite yet seeing that have always been here, or the ones who haven't been on campus yet. And this is where I think about undocumented students. They were always here, but until we started thinking about how to see them, we didn't see them, right? So there's different ways that an inclusive mindset helps us broaden our vision and get our antennae out for groups that are here, but who aren't having equitable experiences. Next slide, please. And this is going to be my last slide, I'm pretty sure. Yes. As journalists, you may be occasionally thinking like, well, I want to get a quote from somebody who does, quote, does DEI on campus. How do I find them? This is actually more complicated than it sounds if you are not aware of how institutions organize themselves. Many institutions will have, Google around for their chief diversity officer, their CDO, some vice president level DEI leader. They will have titles like vice president of DEI or some version of those words. That person sort of is over everything. They look at institutional policy and enforcement, sometimes educational efforts. The Title IX sexual harassment group may go through them for reporting. Bias incidents may go through them. Compliance like EEOC may go through them. But that's kind of that larger level. The Student Affairs and Services Division, sometimes called Student Life, where student support happens, often is a location for DEI. Student affairs folks have been doing diversity and inclusion for a real long time. And they might have the cultural centers, the Black Cultural Center, the Multicultural Center, an LGBTQIA center, a Women's Center. There may be a whole host, and those might be staffed by professionals. There will be a host of identity-based student organizations as well. And those go through Student Life typically. And then Student Life offices, bless their hearts, they're the people who have to, quote, enforce free speech policies. They're the ones who are dealing with protesters about the Israel-Hamas war. Like, that's the group who gets to deal with on a daily basis, typically. Large universities like my own, or medium-sized, will have different colleges, the colleges of ed, the College of Social Science, the law school, the medical school. Those colleges now are having a whole cadre of DEI associate deans at those levels. That's a newer position in the last 5 or 8 years, actually. They are great people to talk to on campus about DEI in particular areas. There will be specialized service centers for student veterans, first and students with disabilities, and then of course, course instructors. If you need a quote about what the intellectual diversity business laws are, course instructors might be the people to go to. So those are a set of different places on campus to find people who you could ask about how DEI stuff is happening on campus. I will turn this over now to someone. Erica?
Yes, so I just wanted to show you and echo what Denise mentioned at the top. And this is sourcing that comes from the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I imagine everyone on this call is aware that the Chronicle of Higher Education is the leading publication of record for higher education in general. And so just to show you that they have been keeping track of bills, in this case, 81 have been introduced across the United States, and now 13 have legislative approval and 11 have become law. So we just want to emphasize the importance in reporting up-to-date numbers with regard to the legislation that is happening around the country where this matters. Some of you may have questions about how to interpret the pullback, both in terms of legislatively as well as policy-based, based on the SCOTUS decision last summer. I'll just say, for now, we don't have any research to offer because no one knows. And a lot of general counsels are choosing a risk-averse strategy to prepare for litigation or to avoid it. And so this is just a way to appreciate how big this backlash to DEI is across the country. So now we're going to look at 5 truths about what the research shows us. And Dr. Wren has already teed up some of this in terms of what she's described, how DEI works, but I'm going to hand it over to Erica to talk about those 5 truths, and then we'll come back to talk briefly about 5 myths. Erica?
Thanks, Khalil. So we're going to get right to it. These are truths that are evidenced and documented by researchers themselves. This is directly demonstrated by rigorous studies that have been carried out by these researchers and the reporting and journal articles that they produced from them. So truth number 1, students perform better academically. These are students from marginalized identity groups, including Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, first-gen students, as well as students, all students. We know this as demonstrated, for instance, from Bowman, Nicholas, and colleagues' study in 2023, that students in STEM courses, when those classrooms had a higher percentage of students who are underrepresented racial minorities, they all performed better. As Dr. Bowman himself references, greater levels of representation benefit students from all different backgrounds. And this is significant because we often, in the conversation about diversity, reduce it to a zero-sum game, right? That one group of students is portrayed as losing out and another group is depicted as winning. Heather McGee has written extensively about this in a larger national narrative and institutional regard, but this is especially true when we're talking about DEI programs that produce those classrooms with a higher percentage of minoritized students. Research from Hurtado echoes this, that there's a relationship between self-reported growth during college and a diverse student body. And lastly, on this first truth, I'll just say the literature on belonging, I saw folks beginning to ask questions about this. It also mirrors this. So Locks, Hurtado, and colleagues in 2008 just demonstrate specifically that positive interactions with diverse peers result in a greater sense of belonging on campus. So we're beginning to fill out this picture of, what is it exactly that these programs produce in terms of, again, these day-to-day experiences, as well as longitudinal experiences of students. Moving to the second truth, the research shows students are less biased and work better on teams as a result of these programs. This mirrors extensively what we see in intergroup contact theory research, which applies both to universities, but also to companies and businesses in any setting where you have groups of people with different identities coming together. Those teams, when they're multiracial or multi-identity, they make better decisions and they perform better. Hallinan in the 90s approved this in research that ethnic diversity in problem-solving tasks leads to solutions that are more feasible and more effective. And Lopez and Zuniga also show us in the higher education setting that intergroup dialogue prepares students to engage more effectively in differences and produces a richer understanding of complexity, especially related to social issues. So let's talk about staff and faculty. Both at schools with DEI programs stay at their jobs longer and are more satisfied at their places of work. And I want to point out here that there's a causal relationship that's also been demonstrated that when there's greater representation of faculty and staff that look like the student body, students also perform better. This is by Fairley and Hoffman in 2013. There's a performance gap in terms of class dropout rates and grade performance that falls by 20 to 50% when taught by an underrepresented minority instructor. And the researchers, right, we also find these interactions affect longer-term outcomes, such as subsequent course selection, retention, and degree completion. So we're talking about better on-campus experience for the faculty and staff, as well as their students. We'll keep it moving here. The curriculum is more engaging. What do we mean by more engaging? Well, we mean that there's greater engaged scholarship. Sturm, Eatman, and other colleagues evidence this by their studies. And this contrasts the current myth that DI produces, and we'll talk about those myths in a minute, but less qualified students or alumni. The reverse, the research shows that it's actually more robust curriculum that's produced and more robust scholarship directly from faculty and student programs engaged in these topics, especially topics that affect students themselves. Lastly, the research shows us that graduating students participate in more civic engagement in politics. Khalil and I work at a public policy school within Harvard, and so this is really important in understanding that students are more likely to participate in local government and politics, as well as have interracial friendships and engage in the civic activities around them when they graduate. Johnson and Lawyer's research from 2002 specifically looks at students surveyed about their attitudes and experiences, and their regression analysis indicates that students with greater exposure to diversity, that results in this greater cultural awareness and political participation. I'll just say, as we move to the myths, we'll be sharing our citations specifically related to the research that I've mentioned. And as we transition into the myths, I think we can keep in mind this foundation and large body of work that both refutes the myths we'll talk about, but also lay the substantial claims of the benefits and documented outcomes of these programs. Over to you, Khalil.
Thank you, Erica. So we're going to talk about these 5 myths, and I can see in some of the Q&A that some of the questions that pertain to these myths are already coming up. So my goal is to get through this very quickly. So I hope by now the first myth, that there's no research to support DEI programs, which was both cited in the Supreme Court decision and has been a major talking point for many who are opposed to DEI currently, simply isn't true. We can debate the merits of the rigor of work, which is what scientists and social scientists do all the time within their own communities to debate what something can actually tell us and the limits of that knowledge. But a blanket dismissal that there is no research is just simply not true. And one of the more robust recent research studies that would pass the kind of rigorous empirical test was completed in 2021 by Chilton and Driver, published in Columbia Law Review. And in a nutshell, they looked at several decades of law review articles, and they compared a situation where several schools that are home to those law review journals had taken on various efforts to increase the population of students who had been historically marginal for those law review boards. And what they found is, out of 13,000 articles, that once a school increased the diversity of its law review editors, there was an increase in citation counts, and citation counts being an independent variable to look at the influence of scholarship. So the argument being that with greater diversity came greater influence or reach for various law review citations. So I'm going to stop on that first myth with that example and move on to the second. DEI values race over merit. Well, the trade-off here has never been proven one way or the other. The idea is that by definition, any commitment to increasing non-represented groups means that those people are by definition less qualified. Simply isn't true. And the reason being is that almost every space in which traditionally underrepresented populations show up have to meet minimal qualifications for admissions. We see this in all aspects, particularly over the fact that so much of the DEI infrastructure doesn't even live on a campus like Harvard or Yale, but lives in non-selective institutions. And so the degree to which any notion that a Black or brown or indigenous woman or someone who is LGBTQ plus or trans somehow got into the school because they met this category is just a talking point for those who are opposed to DEI. You can ask them, what is the evidence? How do you know that this person or these people are unqualified? I will also note that in the medical field, there's been a lot of controversy and backlash recently to changing medical education to recognize that long traditions of clinical practice focused on underrepresented populations who are both missing from clinical trials as well as missing in who wears white coats in healthcare settings has caused a backlash that suggests that more attention to the histories of discriminatory clinical practice takes away preparation for being a good doctor. And there is just simply no evidence for that. People are trained to recognize both the value of clinical practice and the science of medical practice, and that to be able to deliver better healthcare to people who happen to have, say, Black or brown skin or more melanin, in the case of the American Dermatological Association, is just good science and good healthcare delivery. So we can come back to that later. Number 3, DEI promotes division, whereas the colorblind approach encourages unity and fairness. Well, if colorblindness was the dominant approach for, say, the idea of assimilation, it produced ongoing evidences of racial disparities across American life, with no particular attention to creating change for structural inequalities. So if you're going to solve for the overwhelming evidence of implicit bias in society, then you would have to recognize those biases exist in the first place and then build programs to help people to understand why those values are present. And so color blindness doesn't solve for anything related to the biases that we know and that have been proven in academic research. Number 4, DEI has drained resources from budgets or other programs. And here I'll state again that it is a very arbitrary notion that the very thing that people don't like costs too much money would be the equivalent of saying, why do we have football and basketball coaches making millions of dollars, or athletic programs that are straining the budgets of universities, including non-selective ones all around the country, and as a trade-off for instructional time and for the quality of the instructional delivery? Universities and colleges make choices with their budgets, and most of the budgets of DEA offices are 1% or small percent or less of their overall budgets. And so this is an arbitrary critique of the amount of money for people who don't believe in DEI. And then finally, DEI promotes an oppressor versus oppressed framework. And here I want to just lift up that oppression is real in the world. And so the idea that any discussion of oppression means that you are promoting oppression is a talking point of people who actually don't want to deal with oppression. And I would just ask people, for example, how should we talk about the American Revolution in a world where the British oppressed the American patriots? Much of this doesn't make sense. And to some degree, what we are solving for here are the histories of exclusion of these populations, which were by law and by practice meant to say that these people don't belong. And the degree to which DEI helps those people to feel more included and predicated on understanding that history is a key ingredient to what colleges and universities should be doing, which is teaching people how to understand context. And I'm going to hand it off to Erica.
Thank you. Well, Listen, we know many of the folks joining us today are journalists, and so we wanted to provide several key example questions that we're thinking about as researchers when reporting on DEI. We're going to be sharing the slide deck with you all, so I won't go into all in detail at the moment, but I'll just highlight, for instance, that we want to be asking questions when anti-DEI legislation is being enacted about what evidence exists to support that legislation, specific to state and city. We're talking about a conglomerate of attack nationally, and also nuance based on city and state and how these arguments or legislation themselves are being framed. We also want to ask questions related to the racial, gender, and nationality disparities over the last decade. And if DEI is banned, how will these policies, or what policies will address these disparities? So you can read these questions in more detail, but we really encourage the journalists watching to dig into the history, the truth-telling, and the research that we've talked about today.
Oh, you were fast on that one. Sorry, Erica.
I know we're short on time, so gonna keep it moving.
Finally, and we do want to get to your questions. IRA has something called the Race Research and Policy Portal. The link is here on this slide, and we'll put it in the chat. It is a wonderful resource of summaries of high quality academic research and some policy papers by think tanks that help to you as a non-academic community to find high quality research, because much of it is often hidden behind paywalls where you'd have to have a subscription. We don't actually get you to the original articles, but we've written summaries of them, and so you can get the takeaways and the highlights from that research. And of course, if you want to explore further, you can attempt to do so, but at least you'll know what you're looking for. And then finally, as has been promised, we will make the slide available, but we also will list some additional resources that are found here and linked, which you will have in the slide deck. And then there is a citation summary of the research that we described here. And depending on how this conversation goes, we may add to it before we send out the deck. And then finally, just want to thank you again formally on behalf of the presenters, but we now will turn to Denise to get our Q&A going.
Wonderful. Thank you, Khalil and Chris and Erica. Thank you very much. So I've got a ton of questions, but I see that some questions have been coming in while you were talking. One question I would really like to ask, and then I'll get immediately to the other questions because they're all really good ones, is, if you're talking to a room of journalists, and I'm thinking that a lot of journalists are on this call, what is the one thing that you would recommend they do to strengthen their coverage of DEI issues? And when I say, could it be something they start doing, something they stop doing? What would be like the one tip you would give journalists to help them strengthen their coverage?
Dr. Wren, you want to go? We've been doing a lot of talking. Yeah.
Rats. I think the multidimensionality matters. I think the dimensionality of finding out the policy perspective and the campus perspective is important. And I know that journalists can't you can't do focus groups and get like all the things with people, but truly looking for the closest approximation of some balance, and not letting people use this combination of mixed contested purposes and throw DEI on it cynically, as some people I think are using this cynically as a divisive thing, but to try to really get a little deeper than that and not let yourselves as journalists appear to be being used by maybe either side, if I could say either side in this question.
And I have a really quick one. I mean, the short answer would be to show extreme skepticism for many of the claims to justify this. And the example I will give you is that much of what is being blamed on DEI, it doesn't actually have a basis in fact, other than a few anecdotal examples, of some terrible training module that went haywire. And while there are thousands of DEI offices around the country, of which no one can actually know exactly what everyone is doing, precisely as Dr. Wren mentioned, we have some studies, but we have a lot of heterogeneity in the field. And so these blanket claims just simply don't hold up to much scrutiny if you start asking. The analogy I would give is that in the previous administration, the claim of election fraud led to the establishment of an election integrity task force, which has been duplicated at the state level. But I think most journalists now recognize that the election integrity laws were in search of a problem that did not exist. And so I think you want to bring a similar skepticism to this space.
Erica, would you like to answer that question too?
Sure. I'll just briefly jump in and say, you know, at IRA, we're really clear on the need for historical institutional truth-telling. What do I mean by that? What is the history of the institution, or the college or the university? And so often we jump to the now what, or we jump to the, you know, current landscape in almost an isolated bubble. And we need to tell the story of how institutions, and when I say institutions, universities, colleges, individually and nationally explicitly excluded groups of people well into the mid 20th century. And so when we talk about the treatment and exclusion of marginalized groups, we're talking, you know, today about how we repair or correct for those longstanding, not just inequities, but exploitation and you know, lack of direct inclusion in the first place. So journalists should be asking these questions of, you know, does the university know its own history? Do the people who work there know it? And particularly those who are, as Khalil mentioned, are on the attack to remove these critical programs and policies.
Great, great. Those are great questions. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go right to a list of audience questions I'm looking at. And I'm going to start with the first one that came across from Cheryl Swingley from Ball State University. Really great question. Indiana has passed a new law that requires public universities to follow intellectual diversity. What's your definition of these words?
I haven't read the law. I'll just say very quickly that I think, again, the presumption is that various DEI programs somehow shut down discussions about competing ideas and viewpoints. And while we certainly have all heard and read news stories of straitjacketed conversations where people aren't encouraged to ask difficult questions, that is not representative of the field. And frankly, most students don't have engagements with so-called viewpoint diversity through DEI offices. They have the viewpoint diversity issue in a classroom. And there is mostly a firewall between instruction, which faculty lead, and DEI work, which staff and administrators lead. There's tremendous autonomy between what faculty can and do versus what staff support in terms of student life. And so the intellectual diversity issue pertains mostly to what faculty do, at least as I would expect, which is where we want viewpoint diversity to thrive. And all the abuses of DEI czars, or commissars, as they say, are not in the classroom. They would be in some other context on the campus.
And I would add to that the idea that there's not intellectual diversity, ideological diversity across areas, I think it does not reflect the experience of anyone who's been in a classroom. I think that the way that faculty craft classes, you know, the joke that's going around the internet now about the Indiana law being, oh, I can't wait till the business school has to teach Marx. Sort of charming, right? So ideological diversity looks real different in different places on campus. So I think that the people, again, who are saying that faculty are indoctrinating are working from a straw man kind of stereotype, cherry-picked perhaps, but it's not real in my experience at a pretty heterogeneous large public university.
And I would just add, you know, to our timeline that not to mention that the advent of many programs curriculum-wise, like Black Studies, itself did not originate until the 1960s. So we're talking about the canon of intellectual life and of curriculum for hundreds of years that did not either explicitly or even touch on, you know, African-American or Black history, for instance, in addition to, you know, Latinx history, Asian American history, et cetera.
Yeah, and I mean, that's such a good point, Erica, just to lean into it. I mean, you don't even have indigenous curriculum on most campuses. I mean, period, hard stop. And something like so-called quote queer studies is a kind of a second wave version of women and gender studies. And it's still fighting for institutional support. So the notion that somehow diversity viewpoint is being limited is mostly absurd relative to the kind of curriculum expansion that we've seen take place on campuses.
I wanted to ask a related question that you touched on a little bit, but it will ask you to elaborate a little bit more. How do you respond to those who claim DEI is at odds with free speech and academic freedom?
Well, this is probably the most disputed and contested terrain where people who support DEI are also concerned about the restrictions on academic freedom. So let's slice the apple this way. In training people about the histories of race and racism, there is implicit in that, for example, I'm just talking about my expertise, that you're presenting information where opinions or facts that are representative of, say, white supremacist views that have long been in circulation should rightly be challenged by a professor in that context to clarify the difference between the myths that have long surfaced and the teaching that is happening to correct for those myths. I think the hardest and maybe the most analogous case would be if you were teaching the history of anti-Semitism in a classroom, would you expect the professor to correct for anti-Semitic tropes that come up among students who are articulating them, or at least to be challenged in the classroom? Or would you say, oh, well, that's an interesting viewpoint diversity that, sure, and take no position of clarification? Now, because I listened to the 5-hour December 5th hearing where there was a lot of concern by people who, as the Republicans and are attacking DEI at the state level and national level, wanted more teaching about anti-Semitism to correct for this, I would take my cue from them that we want our faculty to be in a position to help students to navigate myths and realities, fact from fiction, and the ways in which bigotries can be perpetrated out of ignorance of how those ideas came into being in the first place. We can move on, Denise, if no one wants to add to it.
Sure. Great question from Nanette Islamov, and forgive me, Nanette, if I've mispronounced your name. Nanette is from the San Francisco Chronicle. She asks, we've had lawsuits in California filed by people who object to being required to sign a DEI commitment as a condition of campus employment. Any thoughts on this?
I have thoughts. And my thoughts run also in the direction of faith statements that one has to sign to work at some institutions. One of the marvelous things about the post-secondary sector in the United States is the wild diversity of institutions we have, public and private. I feel quite strongly, and I have clear friends who will take me down for this. If you're a Christian college and you want to have every student and employee sign a statement about Christian beliefs about some Christian beliefs about gay marriage, you do you. Nobody's making you work there. I believe private institutions should have some flexibility to do that. I believe a private institution to be like, if you're going to come work with us, you're going to have to. I actually don't know of any that make people sign a particular DEI statement. They often make people. I know the Cal State and UC system requires people to submit their own DEI statement for job applications and promotion and tenure. So I'm not aware of ones that are like, you got to sign our the 10 commandments of DEI. There might be some. But I actually believe that private colleges and universities that do not accept federal funding, including for student aid, should be able to do what they want to do. Any institution that does accept federal funding, including for student financial aid, I think should not be requiring a faith statement and should not be requiring people to sign an institutional DEI statement. Should they ask people to submit one of their own? I think is a different question. Again, my queer friends don't love me for that, but
I will just say that most employers, be they public or private, have had the discretion to determine fit forever. And particularly for at-will relationships, employers have had the upper hand in determining whether this person has values that are commiserate with an organization. So the extent to which that happens informally or formally in the case of these statements, to me, is part of a long history of the kind of discretionary power that employers have when it comes to deciding whether you're the right person for this environment. I have some ambivalence about diversity statements in general. I'll just admit to it. I could take them or leave them. But I do want to emphasize to journalists that, make no mistake about it, departments that do faculty hiring and administrators who bring in staff are making judgments about the values articulated by people in interview settings. And so whether those things are written or they're communicated one way or the other is a common practice. So this feels like a particular kind of policing of a particular set of values that is creating a tempest in a teapot, as compared to the larger ways in which we know that discrimination and discretion have been key features of who gets hired to work anywhere.
I'll just say, because California came up, we're seeing the testing ground in California in this example, but I would say especially in Florida, Alabama, et cetera, of, how far can we go with restrictions? And California really sticks out to me, and I think to us as researchers, because of the ban of affirmative action in the state for public schools in 1996. And we saw the direct fallout from that. So as Khalil mentioned, we still don't have the research, in wake of the SCOTUS decision yet, or in wake of the kind of advent of growing attack on these policies and programs in the last few years. We do know from California that in public schools, the decline in enrollment of Black and Latinx students was 40% immediately the year after the proposition was implemented. So just to be clear, I think to pick up on this question around California, which was adjacent, to what I'm speaking to, is that, each of these cases lays the ground for a snowball effect for more states, and also for the echoes of national policy.
Another question from an anonymous person. DEI is about policies, practices, trainings, etc. According to the presentation, should belonging, which is heavily situated in feelings, be part of the DEI canon and work?
I mean, I would speak just quickly for Erica and me. Belonging is another articulation of inclusion. And while there may be some researchers who have a very specific commitment to making a fine distinction between those two, so I want to acknowledge that. The mechanism for most DEI offices, I shouldn't say most, for many, is a climate survey, where they're benchmarking how people feel working or being a student in an organization, and then working towards increasing those numbers. And that's become a popular instrument for focusing on belonging. But belonging is also the language of affinity groups, the language of employee resource groups, which have been around much longer than a lot of the formal policies that we're talking about today.
Quick add to that, belonging is often used in student affairs divisions. It's sort of the student felt experience, or maybe the employee felt experience. And there is a large amount of research that has emerged that sense of belonging is directly related to students' ability to persist through hardships to stay in college. It's kind of the glue that keeps you there when a bunch of other things are trying to pull you away or push you out.
Thank you. And I've got a few questions on this topic, which was also one of mine. Can you talk about what is driving this surge of anti-DE legislation in the last few years? Someone asked about it, was it perhaps related to online education and the changes related to the pandemic? What was it? One event? Did one event prompt some kind of reaction? Can you talk about what is the driver or the drivers of this flood of anti-DEI legislation coming at this point in time?
There is an organized effort by specific political organizations to copy legislation from state to state. Some people, I believe, truly believe what they're saying against DEI work on college campuses, and some are cynically using it to divide the population. That's my analysis.
And I also want to remind people that the language of cultural Marxism, which is front and center, particularly on people who identify on the right or who identify as Republicans, saw the summer of 2020 as an acceleration of the threat of cultural Marxism in America. And people like Christopher Rufo, who became a prominent activist at the time, was picked up by the Trump administration, which is where we kind of saw the beginnings of this moment where Christopher Rufo said that critical race theory was behind all of this. It really was cultural Marxism, but that's complicated. So let's just call it critical race theory so that people can understand it's bad. And Trump banned diversity trainings in federal government with an executive order. And from that moment to the present, we've seen just an uptick in policy changes in legislation and litigation. And we've seen news reporting in the New York Times, which I point people to, where we now know there are think tanks that have been developing the ideas around cultural Marxism as anti-American, as anti-white, as divisive. There's model legislation, as Kristen's already mentioned. And there's the coordination of political actors now that we know who have taken this opportunity in 2023 and 2024 to advance their goals.
And to build on Khalil's point, I'll lastly just say, Christopher Rufo himself was very clear, for instance, in this interview with Politico and other news coverage that in op-eds he's written, that this is a trifecta approach that was very intentional about narrative change, which he has led, and others, the financial leverage piece of, billionaire funders, and finally the political leverage. And so to the points that have just been made, this is intentional and this is strategic, and it's intentionally and strategically that trifecta of each of the actors in those channels.
Thank you. So we are at the end of our webinar. We have a ton of great questions still in the chat box, in the Q&A box, and I will try to get to them. I'll be putting together a tip sheet to post on the Journalist Resource website that synthesizes the conversation we've had today, pulls out some tips in a way that hopefully journalists will be able to make use of quickly. But so you can look for that, and we'll also post along with it the recording of today's event. But before I go, I want to thank everyone for coming today. This was a fantastic conversation. And I obviously want to thank our presenters, Khalil, Erica, Chris. Thank you so much. I have learned a lot from the conversation we've had today. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.